Welcome to Window to Faith.
Welcome back, everybody. As we kick off a new year, I think a lot of us wonder, does that old saying, what you sow is what you reap, does that still hold true?
It's a question that has resonated, I think, across cultures and time periods, this whole idea that our actions have consequences, that eventually, we'll face the results of what we've put out into the world.
Exactly, and we're going to be exploring this idea through an excerpt from a sermon by Pastor Joseph Prince, and he tackles this question with a particularly interesting angle. He focuses on how this concept impacts Christians and how they should think about the year ahead.
Yeah, and he uses some pretty vivid examples to illustrate this principle of reaping what you sow. He pulls from both the Old Testament and historical events.
He does. He starts in the Old Testament with the story of Haman from the book of Esther. Haman, driven by pride and vengeance, he built those gallows to execute Mordecai, but in a twist of fate, he ends up being hanged on them himself.
It's a powerful illustration of how our intentions, especially, rooted in negativity, can backfire on us. Prince even draws a parallel to Hitler, who orchestrated those horrific atrocities during the Holocaust and ultimately met a pretty grim end.
Yeah, it's like that saying, what goes around comes around, that whole idea that actions have consequences, even if they don't always play out in the way that we expect. He also mentions King David, whose actions had lasting repercussions for his family, and even the Roman general Titus, who destroyed the Jewish temple, only to see his own city, Pompeii, devastated by a volcano soon after.
Right. These examples really highlight this concept of reaping what you sow in a way that feels almost tangible, like we're witnessing cause and effect play out on this grand scale.
Yeah, you really see it in those stories. But this is where Prince takes a turn that I think might surprise some listeners. He points out that all these examples are from the Old Testament.
And that's a crucial distinction because Prince then shifts to a New Testament perspective and suggests that with the arrival of Jesus, things changed dramatically.
Yes, and this is where he addresses a fear that I think a lot of Christians, myself included, sometimes struggle with, this nagging worry that our past sins will inevitably come back to haunt us, that we'll be forced to reap what we sowed in a negative sense.
He tackles this head on with a pretty bold statement. He says that through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, those past sins are essentially wiped clean. We're no longer bound to reap those negative consequences. It's like getting a fresh start.
Yeah, it's almost like he's saying that Jesus stepped in and took the hit for us, absorbing the consequences of our past mistakes. And this is where he makes a distinction between reaping and consequences that I found really helpful.
Yes, this is key. Prince argues that while natural consequences still exist, think of the health problems that might result from smoking or those damaged relationships that can stem from treating people poorly. Those are separate from the spiritual consequences of sin that Christ's sacrifice addressed.
So it's like, even if we've made mistakes in the past, we don't have to live in fear of some sort of cosmic payback or karmic retribution. Christ's sacrifice broke that cycle for us.
Exactly, and he goes on to emphasize that this doesn't mean like a free pass, right? Like we can just act recklessly thinking we can get away with anything. Those natural consequences are definitely still in play.
Right. It's not about escaping responsibility for our actions, but more about understanding that in a spiritual sense, because of Christ, we're not chained to the weight of our past mistakes.
Right. And he uses a personal anecdote to illustrate his point. He talks about his time in the Navy when he was tempted to join his friends who were out partying and engaging in some, risky behavior. And while he resisted that temptation, some of his friends faced consequences for their choices.
Yeah, it's like we always have a choice. Those choices lead to different paths and outcomes. What I find really interesting is that Prince doesn't stop there. He goes beyond just avoiding negative consequences, and he really focuses on the positive side of reaping.
Yes, this is where things get exciting. He shifts from this idea of simply escaping the bad to the concept of actively reaping good things, specifically the good things that Jesus sowed through his sacrifice on the cross.
Okay, so help me unpack this a bit. What does it mean to reap the benefits of Christ's sacrifice? Is he talking about material blessings here?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. He's talking about reaping a harvest of spiritual blessings, peace, joy, forgiveness, a deep sense of purpose, and a confident hope for the future. Think of a farmer who plants a tiny seed. That seed has the potential to grow into a plant that yields far more than that single seed ever could.
So in a way, we're reaping a harvest far greater than anything we could have sown on our own. That's a powerful image.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that through Christ, we have access to this abundance of blessings that flow from his sacrifice and his love for us. And this is where his message starts to connect with those hopes and expectations we often have at the beginning of a new year.
Okay, so how does this tie into how we approach 2025?
Well, Prince encourages us to put on what he calls the helmet of the hope of salvation. Now, when I first heard that, I'll admit I kind of pictured a literal helmet.
I can relate to that.
But he's using this metaphor of a Roman soldier's helmet to represent the protection and confidence that come with having hope in Christ. That hope becomes a shield guarding our minds and hearts from fear and negativity, and it empowers us to face the future with courage and expectation.
So it's not just about passively hoping for the best, it's about actively anticipating good things.
Right. It's about approaching the future with this bold sense of optimism and faith, believing that God has good things in store for us. And this connects back to the idea of reaping. If we plant seeds of faith, kindness, generosity, and love, we can expect to reap a harvest of blessings in our lives, maybe even in ways we can't yet imagine.
I love that it's like, instead of dwelling on those anxieties about potential pitfalls or past mistakes, we can choose to focus on the positive and anticipate a future filled with God's goodness.
And that's a really empowering way to step into a new year, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, but I imagine some people might hear this and think, wait a minute, doesn't that sound a bit too good to be true?
Prince acknowledges that some might criticize this viewpoint, especially those who might misunderstand his message. He's not advocating for this reckless disregard for consequences or suggesting that we can simply wish away challenges.
Right, it's not about ignoring the realities of life.
But it is about remembering that we have a God who loves us, who forgives us, and who desires to bless us in some remarkable ways. And when we embrace that truth, it changes how we approach everything.
Okay, so we've unpacked this idea of reaping the distinction between natural consequences and the spiritual consequences of sin, and how Christ's sacrifice offers us a new way to approach the future. But how do we actually apply all of this to our lives in 2025?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's all well and good to talk about these concepts, but how do we actually take this idea of reaping blessings and apply it to our everyday lives, especially as we step into this new year? Well, I think Prince gives us a really practical starting point. He poses this question. Think about it this way. If you could truly let go of those anxieties about past mistakes, knowing that you've been forgiven and you're set free from that burden, what would you dare to hope for in 2025? What would you expect?
Wow, that really gets you thinking. It's like he's challenging us to dream bigger, to break free from any limiting beliefs that might be holding us back.
It is a challenge, but it's an exciting one, because when we release those fears and doubts that can really cloud our vision, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities.
Yeah, it reminds me of that quote, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
It's like maybe we're limiting ourselves without even realizing it, holding ourselves back from experiencing the fullness of God's blessings.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so powerful. It's not just about understanding a theological concept. It's about applying it to our lives in a way that can truly transform our experiences and open up a whole new realm of possibilities.
So practically speaking, what does that look like if I want to step into this mindset of reaping blessings in 2025? Where do I even begin?
I think it starts with a shift in perspective, a conscious choice to focus on the positive, to anticipate good things, and to trust that God wants to bless us abundantly. It's like putting on that helmet of hope, remembering that we're protected by God's love and grace.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
But it's easy to just say, be more positive, expect good things. How do we actually make that shift when, life throws curveballs and anxieties creep in?
I think it's a daily practice, a conscious effort to cultivate gratitude, to focus on what's good, and to remind ourselves of God's faithfulness. It might involve starting each day with a prayer of thanksgiving, reflecting on the blessings in our lives, or simply taking a moment to appreciate the beauty around us.
So it's about those small, intentional choices that over time can really reshape our thinking and our expectations.
Exactly. And it's not about pretending that life is always easy or denying the challenges that we face.
Right. It's not about putting on rose-colored glasses and ignoring reality.
It's about choosing to focus on the truth that we're loved, forgiven, and empowered to live lives that are full of purpose and joy, even amidst the difficulties. And as we cultivate that mindset, we create space for those blessings to flow into our lives in unexpected ways.
It's interesting because sometimes we can get so caught up in striving and trying to earn God's favor or prove ourselves worthy that we forget that grace is a gift.
That's such an important point. It's not about what we do, it's about what Christ has already done for us. And when we grasp that truth, it frees us from the pressure to perform and allows us to receive those blessings with open hands.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, this whole idea of reaping blessings isn't about manipulating God or trying to force things to happen.
Not at all. It's about aligning ourselves with God's heart, trusting in his goodness, and living in a way that reflects his love and grace. Think of a sailboat. When we set our sails to catch the wind, we're not controlling the wind, but we're positioning ourselves to be propelled forward by its power.
I love that analogy. It really captures the essence of what we're talking about. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's that one key takeaway you hope listeners will carry with them as they embark on this new year?
I think it's this. Embrace the truth that you are loved, forgiven, and abundantly blessed by God. Put on that helmet of hope. Step into 2025 with bold expectations and watch in amazement as God unfolds his good plans for your life.
Beautifully said. And remember, it's not about achieving some unattainable level of perfection, but about taking those small daily steps toward a life that reflects God's love and grace. So as you go about your day-to-day, and as you move into this new year, I encourage you to choose hope, embrace grace, and watch as God does immeasurably more than all you could ask or imagine.